Thank you, Jay, and thanks to the ABA and to New Jersey Legal Services for sponsoring this wonderful event. I love to celebrate families. My work in the child welfare system is all about keeping families together, and as Ruth White said, not having to get to the point of reunification, not having so many children, if any children, removed from their families. So I'm glad that it turned out that Ruth spoke first, because she is the leading national expert on this topic, and I knew she would have wonderful advice, concrete recommendations about what to do about the absolute travesty that children and parents are separated because of housing problems. And so my work looks more broadly at the child welfare system and child welfare policy and how it's tied to injustice in this country. And so what I'd like to do is talk about the relationship between housing and child welfare and social justice more broadly, maybe as a call to do the things that Ruth said we should be doing to keep families together and not let housing ever be a reason to separate children from their families. So I thought I'd start with a couple stories. One is from my experience teaching students in a course on child welfare policy. I just recently moved to University of Pennsylvania. I used to teach at Northwestern in Chicago, and I taught a course on contemporary issues in child welfare policy, and I would take my students every year to sit in family court in Chicago to see hearings going on having to do with the placement of children in foster care. And I can remember, well, first of all, I'll say my students were all shocked. They were shocked that parents would have their rights taken from them, their children removed from them, their parental rights terminated without more representation and rights. But one particular case involved a mother who was there in front of the court. And you know how this goes. There's the mother and her attorney, and then there's like an army of people there against her, to explain why she shouldn't get her kids back. And the reason was, the judge just asked, have you gotten rid of the roaches and mice in your apartment? And there was evidence that she hadn't, or at least she didn't have evidence that she had. And the judge said, okay, it took about 5 minutes. Your kids stay in foster care. We'll come back in 6 months. And my students were shocked that children would stay separated for something as easy to fix as getting rid of roaches and mice in your apartment. And they said, why didn't the judge just order that? And in fact, some of the judges then would allow us to interview them, my students to interview them, and they asked the judge. And the judge said, well, I don't have any jurisdiction over the landlord. I just have jurisdiction over this mother. And so that's, what can I do? Well, about a month after that, I participated in a conference on the child welfare system in Norfolk, Virginia, and there was a judge on the panel with me, and he told the story of a very similar situation, but his solution was to issue an order to the landlord to clean up the apartment. And I said to him afterward, it's such a coincidence. I just had seen a hearing in Chicago where the judge said, I have no jurisdiction. He said, well, I don't either, but the landlord doesn't know it. And, not telling any judges to do anything outside their jurisdiction. I'm just saying, if you want to, we could come up with creative solutions to solving this problem. that's a couple cases, but I want to say that those cases are related to a deeper philosophy of child welfare policy that causes one judge to say, nope, your kids stay in foster care for 6 more months, rather than finding, and I'm not putting all the blame on the judges, but the whole system finding other ways of dealing with housing problems. A century ago, child welfare reformers tied children's well-being to broader issues of social justice of their time. So they linked protecting children to ending family poverty and abolishing child labor laws and integrating. At that time, their focus was on European immigrants, and we could fault them for how they ignored African American children and deliberately removed Native American children from their homes. But when it came to poor European immigrants, they wanted them integrated into US society, and they saw that there had to be social changes to do that. And at that time, even up until the 1970s, most of the money in the child welfare system went to serving intact families, not to foster care. So there was another way of thinking about how to care for children in this country. Now, when I began doing child research and advocacy in the early 1990s, I found very little, if any, evidence of this kind of approach to child welfare. Instead, the dominant child welfare philosophy had been transformed to a view that child protective services are there to respond to maltreatment by individual parents without regard to the social context in which families live, or to the political role that child welfare practices and policies play in social change. It had become a very individualized focus. What's wrong with these parents? How can we fix them? Rather than any notion that the hardships that families face, including lack of adequate housing, have to do with society and not primarily with the individual parents. I was especially shocked at how little attention was paid to the striking racial disparities in foster care. Before the civil rights movement, as I just suggested, Black children were excluded from openly segregated child welfare services that catered mainly to poor white families. But by 2000, Black children made up the largest group of children in foster care. And at that time, when I was working on my book, a Black child was 4 times as likely to be placed in foster care as a white child. This huge racial gap has diminished somewhat, but it's still far from disappeared. It's still, I would say, a crisis in the child welfare system. There's another famous story about a judge, maybe you've heard it. A foreign judge was visiting family court in a big US city, like Philadelphia or Chicago or New York City. And when the tour was completed, she turned to her American host and asked, "It was really interesting to visit the court for Black families. Now, when do I get to see the court for everybody else?" Now, think about it. You could have that impression. Think about your latest visits to family court or dependency court. You could have that impression. And you would also, if you came from another country, another planet, you would wonder why there was a system designed to monitor and supervise and even punish parents instead of truly helping children and families. The child welfare system also remains, and it has always been, a system for poor families. So the judge could have just as easily said, thanks for showing me the court for poor families. When do I visit the court for middle class and wealthy families? That's such a given, we almost don't even think about it. It's just so accepted that there are these two segregated family court systems in the United States, segregated by wealth as well as by race. And in some ways by gender too, because most of the families you'll see in court are single mothers and their children. It's undeniable that race, class, and gender still matter to child welfare policy and practice. And so the question of the relationship between child welfare and social justice is just as burning today as it was 100 years ago. How should the child welfare system address the social inequities that we know are what really lead to families being in the system and the families that the system serves? Now, a question that has plagued this topic from the beginning is, where do these disparities or inequities come from? It's often framed as, is it from inside the system or outside the system? So is it because we have lousy housing policies in the United States? Or is it because we have a lousy way of thinking about caring for children and families within the system? Sometimes people will say, well, it's not the child welfare system's fault that the United States doesn't do a better job of addressing economic inequities and injustices. It's not our fault that there isn't a better way of dealing with the housing needs of all families in this country. But I think rather than use that to justify or excuse or ignore the overrepresentation of poor children and children of color in the child welfare system, we should acknowledge that it's because of both. It's because of injustices outside the system, but it's also because of policies and practices within the system that doesn't deal with those injustices. To begin with, the very interpretation of child maltreatment reflects social biases. Which harms to children are detected, identified as abuse or neglect, or considered cause for removing children are determined by social inequalities and biases about poor families. As I said, the child welfare system has always been designed to deal mainly with the problems of poor families. And it then hides the systemic reasons for families' hardships. Most of the cases of child maltreatment in this country stem from parental neglect that is connected in some way to poverty. And lack of housing, as Ruth White said, lack of housing is one of the main reasons that children are removed from their families and are not reunified sooner. And as she pointed out, it is a main contributor to the racial disparities in the child welfare system, because Black children are more likely to be removed because of housing problems and to stay in foster care because of housing problems than white children are. So this focus on neglect related to poverty pretends that equally neglectful but wealthier parents are superior just because they have the money to pay for housing, to insulate their children from child protective services. And this perpetuates false stereotypes and attitudes about poor families. So do we have to wait to fix inequities in broader U.S. society in order to end these disparities in the child welfare system? Well, obviously we should be working to fix the injustices in the greater U.S. society, but again, waiting for that to happen shouldn't be an excuse not to take action to stop the injustices that happen within the child welfare system. In fact, I say that racial and other social disparities in child welfare help to perpetuate an apathy toward these inequities in the broader society. They divert attention from the need for social change because we attribute, or some people attribute, I don't, but the policies attribute the poor families' hardships to parents' deficits rather than to the need for social change. So it functions, see, I think this is one of the main functions of the child welfare system, to convince the broader public that there's no need to fix housing problems in the United States. All we have to do is take children from their families and put them in foster care. That solves the problem. And so, what were you calling it? Epistemic injustice. Epistemic injustice. It's a way of thinking. It perpetuates a way of thinking. That's a problem for those messed up families. We don't have to worry about it. As opposed to, this is a problem we all have to worry about. We have to create a system, a politics in the United States that recognizes the human right to housing. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm saying, how they're connected? So not only is there an obligation to take up the policies that Ruth was talking about that would prevent taking children from their families, keeping them in foster care because of housing problems, but we should also see that if we don't do that, it is going to delay the change, the broader change that we need in society to make this country better for all children. So, in closing, we need more people in the system and those making policies about it to take the position of the judge I met in Virginia, to refuse to tear children away from their parents because of inadequate housing. Find a way to do it. Find a way to do it. It is an injustice to do that. It harms children. There's no excuse for it. And we have to find a way, and I'm glad that Ruth gave us some ways, concrete ways to do it. And we need to even go further, I would say, only by confronting the deep social biases in the child welfare system, biases along racial, economic, and gender lines, can we see the need to radically transform the network of systems, not just the child welfare system, but the education system, the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, all these systems that touch children's lives, from one that relies on tearing families apart to one that generously supports families. Thank you.